Got a bit of movement on the AFL front. The West Australian government has given their two teams an exemption to train in larger groups. So let's bring in Drew Jones again, who's been following this story for us. Drew, what does it mean for the Eagles and the Dockers?
Well, it's good news. Basically, South Australia now the last domino to fall in terms of training exemptions. So that means that WA clubs, Fremantle and West Coast, will be able to remain in Western Australia and do their pre-seasons before eventually relocating to the Gold Coast or southeast Queensland to play their games. So Premier Mark McGowan, it was rumoured this morning that he was going to make some exemptions and make an announcement today. He has done that. Let's hear from the Premier now.
We have worked overnight or over the last couple of days with the clubs, so we're going to permit the clubs to undertake full contact training from the 25th of May in Western Australia, as long as the facilities and arrangements are not open to and used by the general public. We will allow the clubs to use their gym at their training bases from the 18th of May, as long as there's no access by the public and proper cleaning is in place. And if the clubs, if the Gold Coast arrangement doesn't eventuate, and there is a hub in Western Australia with clubs moving here and the Eagles and Dockers staying here, we would allow for full contact training whilst they are in quarantine. So the 2-week quarantine arrangement needs to stay in place. The integrity of the state border needs to stay in place, but we're happy to work within that with the clubs to ensure that they can train and all of those sorts of things.
Good news there in the West, but as you pointed out, Drew, in stark contrast though to his counterpart in South Australia, where does it leave those clubs?
Yeah, well, at the moment, it means that they would have to relocate to engage in full training. Now, if they move to Victoria, say, for next week, then theoretically they'd be allowed to do that. But with those regulations coming in WA, you'd suggest, Jim, that full contact training will start in the AFL from the 25th of May, which is Monday week. So that would, if you allow a 3-week run-up to the season, that would indicate that a June 18 bounce down for the start of round 2 would be the way that it would go. So I would suggest that potentially next week, all states would allow training in groups of 10, because that's currently allowed across the country. So that would be a uniform way to get back to some sort of training for the AFL. The suggestion is it would be 8 players and 2 coaches per group of 10. Now that's possible to start next week. That is allowed in South Australia. That's allowed all around the country. But there is still a hope from the South Australian clubs that potentially the AFL can negotiate a way back to full contact training next week or sooner for South Australia, because otherwise they'd have to relocate to the Gold Coast or to Melbourne to take part in that training. Because as it stands, full contact training in South Australia is not allowed until at the earliest June 8. So that would be a fair wait for those clubs to get back to that, and the AFL obviously hoping to start the season not long after that date. So it's a fair bit to sift through, and we know that the Adelaide clubs will eventually have to relocate, but they'd like to stay in South Australia for as long as possible. Port Adelaide footy manager Chris Davies addressed this morning.
The biggest part of last night's news for us really was the fact that we won't be able to do any contact training until June the 8th. So we need to have that conversation with both the AFL and the government. If that remains, then the reality is that we'll have to move into state, yes, if the AFL look to move with their current timeline of what looks like a return to play in mid to late June. It's not a case that we have to make as much as it is the AFL right now. So the AFL are going to have to obviously go back and have the discussion with the government around what protocols we can put in place, that have worked interstate, because obviously other state governments have made the decision to allow their teams to train in a competitive sense. So we'll work with the AFL and do whatever we need to in order to try and get that lifted in the short term.
All right, Jerry, so WA clubs, as mentioned, have accepted their lot. Still a bit more time at home, but next stop will be southeast Queensland in terms of playing games. So how will it work?
Well, I think the likely scenario, Jimmy, is that we'll have 6 teams in southeast Queensland, so Brisbane, Gold Coast, West Coast, Fremantle, and then Adelaide and Port Adelaide. They won't necessarily all have to play against each other in a hub, but it might be that West Coast play their home games on the Gold Coast, let's say, and then if they're drawn to play against the Victorian team, then they travel south to Victoria. There is also a possibility that these clubs will ask for, I guess, a little bit of special dispensation from the AFL. So the fact that they've had to relocate means that maybe they get to stay on the Gold Coast or in southeast Queensland for the whole time that they're away, so they don't have to, I guess, compound the fact that they're being relocated, that they also have to travel. So there's a number of bargaining chips maybe that these clubs have because they are being put out, and that was discussed by David King on SEN Radio this morning.
If I were the West Coast, if I was Adam Simpson, I'd be saying, let's get that last month of home and away football played at home. Let's get what Richmond got last year. I mean, they got 7 in a row. You're not going to get 7. That's a one-off because there's other home teams at the MCG. But let's aim for 4 in a row at home, and I think that gives you the perfect preparation if you are in a position to challenge. No one's prepared to concede anything. They know it's wrong. They know that it's an unbelievable ask of these clubs that are relocating. But then, do we really want to concede? Ask the clubs that are at the pointy end. Ask Collingwood. Ask Richmond.